Good evening to everyone in India. Good morning to everyone on the East Coast of the US. And good, really early morning to those on the West Coast. Salam, namaste, welcome to our first edition of Theory and Practice, Transnational Conversations in Gender and Sexuality. Some good things have come of being online. And one of the good things that has come to us from being on Zoom all the time is a collaboration between the Centers for Studies in Gender and Sexuality at Ashoka University, where I am, and at New York University, where the center is directed by Gayatri Gopinath. And we are delighted to bring you this first issue of the collaboration that we are delighted to enter into. And as I said before, it's a series called Theory and Practice. And today's topic is called Engendering Caste, Sexualizing Race, because we're trying to think about the mutual interdependence of all these four categories on one another. The US, of course, has just come through a bruising election in which race has played such a huge role. A state in India, Bihar, has just come through a bruising election in which caste has played such a big role. And these are enormously important facets of our life. To help me discuss those facets in relation to gender and sexuality, I have three fabulous panelists with me, whom I will briefly introduce. And after that, we will have conversation, a free-flowing conversation among the three of them, moderated by me, for about half an hour. And the last 25 to 30 minutes, we're going to devote to Q&A. Those of you on Zoom, you see a little Q&A button in front of you. Please post your questions on that at any time during the session, and we will curate them and pose them to the panelists in the last half an hour or so. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the panelists to you. Sameena Dalwai is Associate Professor at the Jindal Global Law School and Assistant Director at the Center for Women, Law and Social Change. She is also the author of the wonderful book, Bands and Bar Girls, Performing Caste in Mumbai's Dance Bars, which came out last year. We also have with us, and delighted to have with us, Thenmozhi Soundararajan, who is Executive Director of Equality Labs in the US, which is a political collective of South Asians in the United States. She is also an artist, a musician, and a media, I was going to say media star, which she is, but also a media artist. And then we have Sumit Baudh with us, who is Associate Professor also at Jindal Global Law School and Executive Director of the Center for Public Law and Jurisprudence. He's written widely on the issues of being Dalit and sexuality and matters of sexuality and how the two intersect with one another. And he too, like Thenmozhi, is an artist. And so welcome to all three of you. Thank you for joining us in discussing these important issues. Let me just begin by throwing out a large, capacious question for you all. And I will call on Thenmozhi to begin, followed by Sameena and then Sumit, if that's all right with you. And I'd like to ask Thenmozhi perhaps to begin by thinking about the lens, the idea, the framework of purity and pollution that have been with us for thousands of years in relation to the ideas of caste and race. All yours, Thenmozhi.
So I think what's so important, in considering that question is that I think we need to ground ourselves in speaking about Brahminical patriarchy. And, of course, we owe a debt to Dr. Ambedkar for really speaking about the ways that caste and gender are so intrinsically linked. But to me, I think what is very important, I think what is really critical in thinking about both gender identity and sexual orientation is that I think we need to take that foundational theory to understand that caste, succeeds by controlling the reproductive function of all genders in society. And so I think when we look at the punishing nature of who is deemed as pure and who is polluted, these are all notions of social control that have no background in any sort of fundamental science and actually are at their will bent to the desires of dominant castes.
Mm.
And I think this becomes very critically apparent when we look at the epidemic of caste-based sexual violence. And again, for viewers that are just getting to understand what this issue is, caste-based sexual violence is the unique spectrum of gender-based crimes that Dalit, communities face. These crimes are really meant to shame the survivor, torment the family, and really, put a very strong boundary on Dalit assertion in the different areas that we see these crimes occur. And they can include shortening of the head, stripping of the body, blackening of the face, and of course, like rape and, murder. And I think the thing that I find so striking about this is that given all of the nonsense about the duties of, the honor of a caste and how, the crimes about what it is to marry across caste lines and the shaming and the violence around honor killings related both to intercaste and interfaith marriages, the reality is all of those notions of purity and pollution go out the window when dominant castes want to rape. And I
Mm.
think this is actually what we need to look at, is that when we look at these epidemics of caste-based sexual violence or the general violence against women and the conditions that we see in India, we are almost always focused on the consequences of Brahminical patriarchy, but not who benefits from it. And we have to just be really clear. No dominant caste, whether it's a Thakur or a Reddy or a Gaundar or a Brahmin or a Kshatriya, is saying, I have to be concerned of my pollution when I'm raping
Mm.
the Dalit women under my power.
Right.
And that's where I think that, all of this, smoke and mirrors around purity and pollution go out the window, and it just lays itself bare as like a violent system based on atrocity that is designed to exploit millions. And sexual violence and gender control are a critical component of that. And to that end, I think that how we see, Dalit queer and trans and femmes articulate the struggle against Brahminical patriarchy is very much in material solidarity with the way that we see Black feminist and Black queer and Black trans and non-binary folks talk about white heteropatriarchy, because these systems of control have a very designed way of using reproductive function as part of their system of control. And that's where we see those corollaries between oppressed peoples, both caste oppressed and those oppressed by race.
Great, great. Thanks, Thenmozhi. Sameena?
Yeah, I find actually that purity and pollution is quite an old framework and introduced to us by old white men. Most of them are dead now. So, what is to me actually more important in understanding caste is what Dr. Ambedkar said is caste is a division of laborers. So he explains this concept, right? That in the Marxian thing, in general economics, we understand division of labor as leading to efficiency. But he says at birth, when you are given a task and your occupation is decided already at birth, not based on what you might like or not like, your aspirations or what your aptitudes might be, that is division of laborers, not division of labor. And that I find the most apt understanding of caste. To me, caste is actually a pyramid of labor. And so, within that, if I'm speaking of sexuality, and I'll come to my work later, when I speak of sexuality, it is again obligation and entitlement of labor, obligation of the lower castes, Dalit included, and entitlement of upper caste to that labor. So, in this, if you look at the pyramid of occupations in a village that was supposed to be a caste based society primarily, that is the whole of economics there is based on caste, and your obligation and entitlement is certain there. So in this, sexual labor becomes part of that.
Hmm.
And so Actually, I believe that pollution purity would be quite mute if political power, education, employment, and class was actually in favor of the lower caste. That many people say the whole spectrum of identity politics through votes that Mayawati and Kanshiram's party did, that Lalu Prasad Yadav's and other Yadavs, the whole play with dominant caste. For the American viewers, dominant caste is a political category. Castes which are numerous in numbers, but also so which have to be lower caste, because to be numerous in numbers you have to be lower caste in the pyramid of caste. However, they are also in the pure caste, in the sense they are not hitherto untouchable caste. So these are called the OBCs, or the Shudra Varna caste, which are all the artisans, manual laborers, peasants, etc. So these form the dominant caste in India, to form in many states governments. And that was a play of caste, in which they said that political power, if we attain, then all these idea of pollution and purity, that they don't want to eat with us, they don't want us to go to their temple, it doesn't matter, we don't go to their temples. Anyways, Dr. Ambedkar also decided, I will not die a Hindu, I was born a Hindu, I will not die a Hindu, because I, where that God doesn't want me, I'm not going there. That would not matter, if, because it would become a matter of personal choice. If somebody doesn't want to sit with me, it's fine, as long as I manage to do all the other things which are class based. So that I feel would be an important framework of understanding class, that it is a matter of economics, and it is a matter of labor. And about sexuality, anyways, it's not my research. Anupama Rao's huge book, The Question of Dalit Question, has already spoken of what Thenmozhi said, that there is an informal sexual circuit and there is a formal sexual circuit of caste. In formal sexual circuit, you have the arranged marriage within your caste and clan, and then there is, which you do only within your caste, and you go for pure women of your caste. This is for the upper caste. Then the upper caste men indulge in informal circuit of sexuality, where they go for lower caste women, which they don't marry or create progeny with, but have access to sexually. And that then remains again their right and entitlement, and it becomes the obligation of lower caste women. Dalit women have faced this far more, but so do OBC women throughout the history. Yeah, as of now.
Thanks, Sameena. Sumit?
Jai Bhim, Rainbow Salam, everybody. Thanks very much to Ashoka University and NYU for organizing this event. My point of entry into a comparative analysis of race and caste, especially on the lines of purity and pollution, would be perhaps to collapse the lines between race and caste. And the way in which this line between race and caste is collapsed is when we read a 1923 judgment of the US Supreme Court in the case of Bhagat Singh Thind, who at the time is attempting to gain citizenship of the United States. Bhagat Singh makes a comparison whiteness with being Aryan. Therefore, Bhagat Singh Thind draws upon his caste composition as an Aryan, and with that tracing of a lineage, attempts to present himself as white. In this Supreme Court judgment, then, there is a collapsing of race and caste categories, and there is the ambition, there is the aspiration of a South Asian diaspora to present itself not as persons of color, rather on the lines of purity of the Aryan race. We know that other ways in which this purity, this blood purity, manifests in the discourse on race and the law in the US historically is what we know as the one drop rule. And this one drop rule was such that even a drop of colored blood rendered whiteness of a person's spoiled. That means a person's whiteness was determined by the non-corruption, by that there was no impurity of any colored blood. In this way, the composition of blood and racial categories is drawn into the ways in which racial categories were not only historically and culturally imagined, but these were the ways in which the law sanctioned racial categories. We know that in the famous case of Plessy versus Ferguson, Plessy was seemingly white, and yet just a one part blood rendered him a person of color. We also know that there are more contemporary ways in which uh, matrimonials in South Asian, in this part of the world as in India, are still formulated on lines of caste. So even when we talk about caste being a relic of the past, we know that there are contemporary ways in which matrimonials, contemporary matrimonials published in national daily newspapers have a whole page-long section in which the matrimonial alliances would be neatly organized on the lines of caste denomination. So it seems very little has changed from a time generations ago in which matrimony was sought within the confines of caste categories. That matrimony continues to be sought within the confines of those caste categories. We know that some of these frameworks of purity and pollution are dated, which is not to say that they are false, that they are entirely false. Yes, there are ways in which these ideas are pushed back, especially with the way in which Thenmozhi and the way in which Sameena both contested the relevance and applicability of ideas of purity and pollution. Along with these ideas, we need to understand the role that sexual violence plays in enforcing domination, the role that sexual violence plays in inflicting systemic humiliation. Those are the ways in which we could engage with more contemporary Dalit scholars who are developing an understanding of what does it mean to undergo humiliation, in what way does humiliation play out on our psyche, and the instrumental or the strategic ways in which humiliation is used to subordinate communities on a routine and recurring basis. On lines of intersectionality, when we understand the composition of certain categories and the ways in which those categories are brought into the domain of law reform, we know even in those, especially as we understand representational intersectionality, there is a certain purity of the claim. And that purity of claim is often composed on the lines of what we know as a single axis framework. That means that when there is a representational claim made on behalf of women, that is often a claim on behalf of white women. When there is a representational claim made on behalf of women in India, that is often a claim that is made on behalf of Savarna women. Those are the ways in which we can understand an applicability of purity and pollution in which representational intersectionality illuminates the composition of social movements and illuminates the ways in which social movements are represented within the domains of law reform. And as we look to an area of law reform that is unfolding as that of same-sex marriages, we need to only evaluate the composition of these claims, and we might find that there are replicating factors that are replicating ideas of purity and pollution. Back to you, Madhvi.
Thank you. Thank you, all three of you, for getting us off to such a wonderful start. I'm just going to build on some things that all of you have said and just ask you very quickly, how broad do you think this conversation should be? I mean, Thenmozhi said so resonantly in her opening remarks about how the blackening of Dalit people's faces was often a punishment or meted out to them as a punishment. And I want to think about that idea of blackness, of course, in relation to both race and caste, and what happens, how that idea is playing out. And in relation to Samina's sense of this being an economic based or the economic basis of this kind of caste atrocity, how broad does the conversation need to be there? And of course, Sumit brought up this idea of intersectionality and having a broad-based conversation. So my question to all three of you, in whatever ways you'd like to talk about it, how many people should be part of this conversation? How broad should it be? What is that role of that single axis that Sumit was talking about in relation to breadth? What do we make of that? Thenmozhi, please.
So I think that, for me, I think that the conversation is already broad in that, we have, through social media and through movement building, we are hearing caste oppressed voices unfiltered from dominant caste mediation for the first time in such a large way across many different platforms. And I think the challenge here is that people assume that what it's going to take to dismantle caste and Brahminical patriarchy is simply a cognitive practice. But I think if we were going to end caste apartheid we already have numerous books. We've had workshops, we've had seminars, and guess what? Dominant caste people are still raping. This is not an issue of not having enough data, not having enough legal theory. There's actually something broken about the cultures of complicity that have really created generational levels of trauma that need to be discussed and engaged with in different ways. And so for me, I don't know that it's like, let's have more intercaste conversations where Dalit people speak about our violence and dominant caste people, virtue signal and nod about what a terrible thing it is, but nothing changes in dominant caste networks. There actually has to be a deep reckoning within dominant caste families and institutions as to why they have been so silent about the epidemic of caste, violence for centuries. And I see it in the diaspora. I see it, in our homelands. When I first started my work, I can't tell you how many doors were slammed in my face when I spoke about the reality of caste apartheid. And when later, as we started to talk about the issues of caste-based sexual violence, there was still a denial about who are the castes that benefit from caste rape. So what I actually think is, instead of a broad conversation that stays in the same place without pushing the roots of impunity, I think that dominant caste people need to do their own work right now. And I think there's a great book by Resmaa Menakem that talks about, who is a Black therapist who looks at the lens of white supremacy through the lens of white body supremacy. And he talks about how there is a way that, those that are oppressed by race, experience trauma under this violent system, but so too are the people whose privilege is built on that. And part of that trauma is really the trauma of complicity, of silence, and invisibilizing the networks of structural privilege that they gain. And that is an internal conversation, because when I talk to dominant caste people, we have a training that we do in Equality Labs called Unlearning Caste Supremacy. What we find is these same patterns of violence that have been used against caste oppressed people have literally destroyed dominant caste families, because we see that same arrogance, that same practice of disposability of bodies and quietness in the face of violence has led to, epidemics of child sexual abuse and domestic violence, and the casualness of the disposability of queer and, femme bodies. But to talk about that honestly means we really have to be able to sit with this process and talk about what it means to be a society that is ravaged by violence, and a society that refuses to look at the violence. And whenever it decides to talk about it, decides that it's only going to talk about the bodies and not the minds and spirits that have allowed that system to be built. And I think that's a very radical way to think about this conversation, as opposed to the status quo, which is we have this terrible system. Let's talk about the data. Oh no, there's no source or no root. But we actually know all the castes that rape. All of the castes that rape are the castes that are in power. Caste dominance is built on a rape culture. And Dalit women and queer and trans people don't want to have a single thing related to that anymore. We don't want to be quiet about it. We don't want to have another generation continue where we see our bodies as fertilizers for the ambitions of caste power. And this is the time to change everything. Because if COVID has taught us anything, is that we don't have to accept the systems that yoke us and dehumanize us and destroy our dignity. If we are going to rebuild, don't we want to rebuild a world where all of us are free?
I'll, I'll come back to that because unfortunately, at least in India, the pandemic seems to have seen a re-entrenchment of privilege and injustice and inequality rather than, you know, imagining a brave new world, unfortunately, but certainly something to talk about. Sameena, please.
I feel the conversation about caste has actually begun in India in this new generation of politicians also. So we see a lot of Dalit and OBC young men and women being part of politics and garnishing support of everyone. So we saw a lot of people uh, in actual politics we are seeing now, and we saw this alternate politics in JNU, in universities in Delhi, where many of the leaders were Dalit. So it was actually or lower caste. So it has been an interesting conversation, and as I said earlier, that political power, to me at least, political power and economic power are the main thing to dismantle any kind of, say, master's palace. And that has begun. The glitch in this, to me, is that Dr. Ambedkar's stories come to me many times. He was traveling with his comrade somewhere in his little car that he had acquired when he came back from USA, and he was going somewhere on his mobilization, and they stopped somewhere to drink water from a farm. And people, farmers saw them, they realized they are Dalit. Actually, he used to wear this full suit, but it was still at that time very easy to discern who's what caste. They realized they are Dalit, all of them, and they came to bash them up. And he realized that they are Muslim. So he said, but you are Muslim. We are, I mean, why are you beating us up? And he was extremely disheartened by this incident, and he said, what is untouchable to the upper caste Hindu is untouchable to the Muslim also. So even in Muslims, there was this Dalit hatred. Obviously, the Islam in India is also guided by caste. There are Ashrafs and there are Ajlafs, which is upper caste Muslim and lower caste Muslim. So that conversation did not happen at that time. So when he wanted to choose a different religion, he chose Buddhism because Islam was already, Muslims were not accepting of Dalits. And that then failed. Now I feel it is the same conversation must happen. And that is, so let us look at the flip side of this. When riots happened in 2002 in Gujarat, uh, a lot of places, Dalits and tribals were in the aggressors, killing and raping Muslims. So this OBCs sadly have always been part of aggressors whenever they can against Dalits. So the Khairlanji massacre, when that happened, they were not uppermost caste. They were not the first three Varnas, but they were Mali. They were gardener caste men and families who came for the Dalit Mahar men and women, this family. So in 2006, people who don't know, there is a village called Khairlanji in Maharashtra, where there was a very heinous crime of rape and sexual mutilation against a family that was put as by the court also as something which is a property dispute. But as Thenmozhi explained that, and Sumit also, that it was domination. And so they did this whole thing of parading people naked and going through the whole village for a whole day. So all of this. So when I was reading that, and it struck, they were not Marathas. I expected them to be the uppermost caste of Maharashtra, but that was not so. They were OBC caste. So what I'm trying to say is each section, that the dream that all of these minorities and marginalized sections of people will come together to build a new India seems to not actually have been created in discourse or in politics yet. Uh, and that conversation, I don't know about broad or narrow, but that conversation needs to happen. Maybe some of the political leaders are ahead of us, and maybe we are not able to do that conversation.
Hard to think of political leaders being ahead of us, but I take your point, Sameena. Sumit?
How broad does this conversation need to be? I will start with reference to Sojourner Truth and her speech, Ain't I a Woman? And the context in which that speech was delivered was in the context of women's suffrage, right to vote. And Sojourner Truth, her speech, Ain't I a Woman, could have seemingly diluted the claims of women because it could have shifted, or it was feared to shift the conversation from that of women's rights to the anti-racist movement. And yet it was that speech that illuminated the intersectional potentials of women of color and ways of understanding subordination. So when we pose the question, how broad does this conversation need to be? We need to keep sight of historical moments as those. We also need to keep sight of historical moments as the census of 1911 in India, that for the first time counted a category known as depressed classes. That census would not have been possible if it was not for the support of Muslim League in India at the time. How broad does this conversation need to be? Needs to be understood in relation to that strategic support that came from the Muslim League in making the census and the counting of depressed classes possible, that then led to a political recognition of the numerical strength that there is, the constituency of the so-called depressed classes. And we shift 100 years from 1911 to 2011, when for the first time the census of India counted a category as male, female, and other. And in this counting, there was a surfacing of a transgender or a third category. And yet the very formulation of this category was othered, which was othered from that of male and female. How broad does this conversation need to be? Needs to be understood in this very idea of othering that makes or that alienates a category, and yet is the site of origin, is the site of genesis then of what emerges as a third gender. When we understand race and caste, especially as we understand the ways in which law reform are mobilized along these categories, we know that certain legislation, such as the Protection of Civil Rights Act, such as the Scheduled Caste and the Scheduled Tribe Prevention of Atrocities Act. These are protective legislations, and yet the very conceptualization of civil rights in India is more selectively and more narrowly along the lines of caste. That is not to say that there is a foundational significance of caste. Yet in contemporary times, we find there are claims for and on behalf of constituencies that are influenced, that are affected by gender discrimination, sexual orientation discrimination, and categories as these are then left trying to make of certain existing categories and trying to extend and broaden their application. How broad does this conversation need to be? Then would have to be seen in a certain legal conceptualization that narrows it. Therefore, how broad does this conversation need to be would have to be understood in the existing narrow parameters that there are within constitution and legal conceptualization. Silence and invisibility of Dalit academics, of Dalit legislators, of Dalit judges, those are sites of profound silence and invisibility. How broad does it need to be? Needs to be understood with how distorted the currently, and how we need to we need to illuminate, we need to shine a light on certain areas that are rendered obscure because of silence and invisibility. It isn't even about a inclusion. It is about a systemic silencing. It is about a systemic invisibility that has occurred that needs to be undone. And last point, how broad does this conversation need to be in our understanding of global South and global North? When we understand categories as these, as homogeneous and then homogeneously composed, then we know that neither the global North nor the global South is so homogeneous. So to say, there are people of color, there are subordinate segments within the North, there is poverty within the North. So when we homogenize the North as the dominant, we look away from the possibility of, or the subversive potential that there are in certain theoretical frameworks as that of critical race theory. Likewise, when we compose global Souths as subordinated to global North, we ignore the caste constituency of this global South. When we position ourselves as feminists from global South, then we ignore the caste constituency of feminism in India that is composed of a certain dominant caste composition. So when we have the conversation, then we think about broadening that conversation, we've got to be able to unpack and understand the ways in which global North and global South have been composed. Back to you, Madhvi.
Thank you. Thank you all. This has been quite fascinating. I would love to speak more about what Thenmozhi brought up about the idea of the psyche and the psychic cost of caste and race, the psychic cost of gendered and sexualized brutality and categories. I would love to speak much more about what Sameena was talking about the lack of solidarity among marginalized people, and also what Sumit was talking about, which is remembering that these categories that we call homogenous are in fact far more riven among and within themselves than we choose to point out. We do need to, however, start taking questions from the audience before we have a riot on our hands. So I'm going to try and sneak in some of these other questions as well in the middle. But for now, I just want to welcome my colleague Shiv, who has been culling and curating the questions that the audience has piled up for you. So Shiv, up to you, all yours, and I might sort of insert a question of my own in the middle. Please.
Thank you, Madhvi, and thank you all for such a rich conversation on many fronts. So just picking up on one stand, the first question I want to ask you all is about the notions of self-respect and dignity that are often sort of crucial to anti-caste politics, while they also turn into moral claims that come up against the concerns of feminist and queer politics. For instance, with regards to issues of livelihood and economic and sexual autonomy, as with the sex workers. So I'm just, if you could all address about such kind of frictions between feminist and queer politics and anti-caste politics in either of the context, American or in India.
Any of you can jump in at any point, I think. We could follow the same order. Thenmozhi, if you'd like to start, please.
Well, I think that, the fact that there's such harsh categories in the question actually shows the failures of feminism without a caste analysis in the South Asian context. To me, I feel like, the process of having more caste oppressed voices with equity at this table is that what we're finding is that if we want to speak to an intersectional politics, we actually have to have an intersectional practice. That means you cannot have dominant caste panels that speak about feminist liberation and not have Dalits and Dalit queer and trans people present. You also cannot have a theoretical understanding of what it means to be free of patriarchy without talking about being free from Brahmanism. And I think within those kind of ideological foundations, you find that you cannot have a moral frame that excludes communities that have experienced exclusion and violence based on these purity and pollution divides, whether that's queer people or trans people or people who no longer serve reproductive function roles in society as widows or what have you. The heteronormativity that has been so violent to all bodies within the subcontinent is the thing that we need to basically explore, explode, and move past. And I think people are finding new ways to build consent and love and power in all sorts of, family configurations, chosen family or blood family. But the reality is that we cannot continue in the way that it has continued because there is no freedom if only dominant caste women are free. I mean, that's ridiculous. There's also no freedom if only Savarna queer people are free. That's also ridiculous. So thinking about the ways that we see our discourse shape laws that promote inequity and invisibilize huge bases that are impacted by Brahminical patriarchy does no one a service, which is why this need for self-reflection and also moving beyond transactional solidarities to material solidarities, where people start to think in the model of co-liberation, I think is really critical.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sameena, Sumit, does either of you have something to add?
I am actually going to go back to the specifics of my work to answer this question.
Okay, but succinctly, Sameena, because we need to take as many questions as we can.
So it is basically this dance bar debate and the ban thing that I address in my book that came last year. That is basically trying to engender caste in the sense that if you are trying to understand caste in its gendered forms, how would caste system work or how does it look when it is dealing with women? And so women of the lower castes, when they are in the market and first time in a unique industry of dance bars, to let us compare it to a New York strip club, but actually this was not stripping, it was full Bollywood attire and the whole neka or drama of Bollywood that women were presenting for in these dance bars. Then how does the discourse get created? So all feminist writing was about this, that there is a curtailing of sexuality, that there is this is subaltern sexuality that is being curtailed, that the whole discourse of obscenity and nationalism, that is a problem, that dance is an expression of the self and expression of a human being, etc. My take on this, and that was the only kind of thing that came from interviews of also the the male customers that went to the dance bars, was that it was not about nationalism, sexuality, dance, obscenity. It was coming back to class. It was that we believe that a certain kind of woman of a certain class, so there is caste and gender coming together, a lower caste woman ought to earn only this much. And so if she earns beyond that, that becomes a problem. Then all the discourses are a facade that are used to actually speak about this. They don't want to speak about this, but the main thing was easy money. Everyone told me that these women are only shaking their bum and they are earning easy money. Why are they not going to work hard and make papad and achar when they could do that? Why do they go to the dance bars and sell their sexuality? They were not really selling sex, not the main transaction. There could have been sex sold, but not the main transaction of dance bars, which was actually dance. And so, my coming back to my earlier point, that all the discourses got created around all the other things that are sold very easily in India: nationalism, dance, obscenity, sexuality, etc. But the main thing was lower caste women earning more than their due. And that's why I'm saying that it is about actually class.
Thank you. Sumit, do you have anything to add?
Very quickly, dignity in feminist and queer politics, taking a cue from Sameena and the example of dance bars. As much as the feminist discourse was acutely conscious of the caste and class constituency composition of dance bars, what there was a complete silence about was in the legal discourse. When the Supreme Court decided the matter, there are only marginal observations about the caste and class composition of women, and what is foregrounded is more abstract ideas of equality and arbitrariness on the part of the state. And this is a classic gap in which, even when there is a nascent consciousness of caste and class composition of women, there is not an understanding of that consciousness in the legal discourse in the courts. Queer politics. We know that the ways in which privacy is understood in the Constitution of India cannot be separated from dignity. This is very different from the ways in which privacy is understood in the English-speaking parts of the world, in which right to privacy stands on its own. In the Indian subcontinent, the ways in which privacy is understood is that it is understood in relation to dignity. There is no right to privacy absent or without its location within a certain understanding of dignity. Here's the trouble with dignity. When we understand dignity in abstraction, we are often almost blindfolded, in which we don't get a sense of what is this dignity. And here is where experiences of subordination, experiences of inequality, violence, and discrimination, and more specifically, humiliation, inform a context to an understanding of dignity. When we want to understand dignity, we have got to be able to understand indignity. We cannot understand dignity in abstraction. And that is where, when we invoke ideas of privacy and dignity within queer movements, we've got to be able to understand this idea in relation to indignity. Back to you, Matri.
Thank you. Shiv, actually.
So just taking off from there, the next question is again about these intersections. Does the lack of thorough solidarity between queer and anti-caste politics suggest the broader limits of thinking about both sexuality and caste as identitarian categories? I'd love to hear something about that.
And can we add race to that list as well? Because I just want to remind us that this is also a conversation about caste and race, and the potential sort of overlaps or not between those two categories. So,
Can I jump in there?
Please, Sumit. Yeah.
So when we talk about certain identitarian frameworks or identitarian categories, we've got to be able to understand what is an identity and what is a legal category. Often when we speak of constitutional categories as that of race, as that of sex, as that of caste, these are given categories that may or may not be defined in any specificity. Specificity could often come with identities as women. We give an example of Article 15. Article 15.1 mentions certain categories. while Article 15, Clause 3 grounds specificity of women. Thereby, the Constitution is invoking certain identities as categories of non-discrimination. When we understand any political mobilization, we must understand that that political mobilization occurs within the given confines of or the given parameters of certain identity formation that has already occurred. Beyond a level to critique that identity formation is to engage in what Kimberly Crenshaw has called in her works as vulgar anti-essentialism, because categories don't always, or identities don't always have a choice, don't always choose to present themselves as such. There are certain identity frames that are placed on given groups. When we understand any kind of political mobilizing, we've got to be able to understand that all identities are not a matter of choice. These are social constructs, these are legal constructs, and there are ways in which categories and identities have to be negotiated in a tandem, especially as we explore the sites of law reform, because of the essentialist nature of law as a discipline. The core phenomenology of the law often requires certain essentialist reading of these categories and related identity groups. Over to my fellow panelists. Anybody else who wants to step in?
And Maurice, Sameena, no, we can move on then, because I'm sure there are many other questions.
I think I answered this question earlier.
Right. Okay. Okay, thanks. Shiv, why don't we go to our next question?
The next question is kind of related to this, and the person is saying that we've talked about how one's caste position impacts one's sexual practices, but they want to ask, how could a sexual or gendered position impact one's caste? What happens politically when an upper caste person assigned the male at birth transitions into another gender? Does caste work the same way for them, race or caste for that matter? Do we need to theorize their caste differently? And if so, why?
Great, thank you. I'll ask Thenmozhi or Sameena to start on this one, please, and then we can move on.
I find this question really confusing. I think that in many ways, if someone is dominant caste and then they change their gender, they've changed their gender, but they have not fundamentally shifted in terms of their ancestral privilege related to caste dominance. And in fact, what we see in many dominant caste queer and trans networks is you see this leaning into dominant caste tropes as a way to slide in acceptance of their gender expression. So I'm thinking like very specifically about that one advertisement of this Brahmin mother who said, "I support my son's choice in being queer," who then put a marriage advertisement, an iyer looking for an iyer. These things are not transformative. These things aren't a queer radical politic. They simply are a caste politic. Someone doesn't disappear out of that practice, particularly if they lean into it as a way to try to align heteronormative norms within their caste cultures. So I actually think that this is something that is very important to look at, because we also see dominant caste queer and trans institutions and individuals often play into caste politics and supporting a narrative that erases caste violence. And so I think that, we should just assume, like we see in terms of the United States, it was really because of the agitation of Black trans and Black queer survivors of police brutality that we were able to hear the stories of Black trans and Black queer people about their urgent questions around anti-Blackness and the police. And I think that the broader queer community certainly didn't prioritize their issues. They had to put them at the forefront. And so I think that we have to be careful of a consumer, kind of one, queer liberatory politic that doesn't actually speak to real liberation. And some of that has to be very deeply looking at the fact that, is partially being free real freedom? If my freedom is actually based on the oppression of other people, is that actually freedom? And these are hard conversations that, queer folks of color, in the United States have very deeply pushed the broader queer and trans movements that would refuse to kind of look at intersectional politics. And I think that the reckoning within, the dominant caste queer and trans movements in South Asia are similarly facing huge pushbacks from Dalit queer and trans and non-binary people who refuse to be erased, who refuse to take on some sort of consumer model of, queerness that doesn't look at the ways that our people are being murdered and violated every day. And, you just have to look at this shit show of a movie, Lakshmi, to know we are not any farther in terms of the things that we need for queer and Dalit liberation when we are able to see, commercial garbage like that come out. And I think that it's important that, we stop staying at these elementary level conversations. Any Savarna person that makes that argument would, without a doubt, in the United States, start virtue signaling if they heard a white person who was queer or trans saying, "Am I not white anymore because I've transitioned?" Give me a fucking break. Let's just be real about what we're talking about with structural privilege. This is a joke to be having these kinds of conversations. And it really comes from the level of softness that dominant caste people have in terms of their own self-reflection of what caste is. Caste is not, fancy dress and, casual slurs. Caste is a violent, disgusting, horrific system that has raped and murdered millions of people. And the exploitation of our labor, of our lives, of our futures have been the foundations of what has allowed caste privileged people to survive in modern India. When you recognize the blood on your hands within that, you would never ask a question like, does my caste privilege disappear? It may be harder to hang out with your heteronormative family, but you are still, at the end of the day, still a dominant caste person.
Sameena, Sumit,
And
very
if we
quickly,
could
please.
draw references, yes,
Sumit,
if you can draw
Sumit, I'm
references from the
sorry.
rhetoric as
Can I just have Sameena speak very quickly first, please?
Oh, let him go first. It's fine.
Okay, you have between the two of you a minute and a half, please.
so a rhetoric as gay is the new black that presents seemingly separate constituencies of being gay and being black could be compared with an idea that is presented in the National Legal Services Authority versus Union of India, a Supreme Court decision in 2014, that presents the idea of transgender persons like untouchables. These kinds of formulations that separate categories presume certain purity of categories as of transgender, devoid of untouchables. And we want to ask, how does this happen? How is it that this legal composition occur? Does it occur in void? Apparently not, because one of the representational claims in this public interest litigation, an impediment application is filed for and on behalf of somebody whose caste constituency is clearly Brahmin. So when Lakshmi Narayan Tripathi is presented as a transgender person, devoid of any caste denomination, that goes to show how Lakshmi Narayan Tripathi would be received as a transgender person devoid of any caste relation, caste denomination. And yet, in the very arguments of the impediment application,
Sumit, you've got
there
to
is
hurry, please.
invocation of Hindu scripture. So it is not just about identities.
Sure.
It is the arguments that are mobilized and the ways in which Hindu scriptures are mobilized that speak of a certain Brahminical idea.
Thank you, Sumit. Yeah, Sameena, very quickly.
I am going to now make this conversation a bit more fun by disagreeing with my fellow panelists. And See, in Peshwa time, Uma Chakravarti has written in Engendering Caste and in her Pandita Ramabai book that in Peshwa times in Maharashtra, the single most category of highest category of identity that committed suicide were the young Brahmin widows that were within their families sexually exploited. If you see now in 2019, if we looked at the Delhi hospitals, the top 5 hospitals give birth to more boys than to girls. So people go check out the fetus gender, and then they come, and if they know it's a boy, then they come to a good hospital to give birth to a boy child. The girl fetus they deal with elsewhere. Looking at these two, I do feel that there is something about gender category along with caste category that we cannot lose the sight of. If we are only going to look at caste, then there is no intersectionality. If we are only going to talk about Dalits within the caste system and not about all the OBCs and people within who are a little bit ahead of Dalits but are within the non-dominant caste groups, then again there are no networks and possibilities of conversation. And then how do you push this politics ahead?
Great. Thank you very much, Sameena, Sumit, Thenmozhi, for that wonderful, sparkling, scintillating, contentious, fantastic conversation, which just goes to show how many threads are woven into the tapestry of the categories we are discussing, and how many consequences and effects these actually have on our lived everyday realities. So I want to thank you and end by announcing that our next session in Theory and Practice will be on colonialism, sex, and disease, and will be held on December 2nd at the same time, 9 p.m. India Standard Time on December 2nd, but you will all be receiving information about that. So I'd like to end again by thanking all of you for attending, and to thank Thenmozhi Soundararajan, Sameena Dalwai, and Sumit Baudh for being our fantastic interlocutors today. Thank you, good night, and have a good day. Bye.
Thank you.